After years of silence, fate brought them back to the same place. Ella, who had been dominated by the power and manipulation of a ruthless man, was now different. She was no longer the woman the president of a large company knew he could control with a simple look or a command disguised as affection. No, time, choices, and challenges had molded Ella into someone he barely recognized. The man in question was Richard Hale, an unbeatable tycoon, president of one of the largest corporations in the United States, known not only for its influence in the business world, but also for its authoritarian and imposing style. During the years they were together, Richard always exerted a form of dominance over Ella, mixing love and control, and she, confused, believed that this was what the relationship required. He saw her as a piece on his chessboard, someone he could mold in his own image, without realizing how much he was breaking her essence. But time passes and things change. Ella drifted away, disappearing from Richard's life without warning. The reasons for the breakup were always unclear to him. She left a letter, simple but full of pain, saying she needed to find herself and leave the past behind. At that moment, Richard, with his pragmatic outlook, didn't care. In his mind, it was a simple emotional weakness that she would eventually overcome. Now, years later, she's back. Richard didn't know exactly what to expect from this reunion, but one thing he was sure of. Ella was no longer the submissive and lost woman he remembered. She appeared in town at an exclusive event, organized by her own foundation to support women in situations of emotional and psychological abuse, something Richard would never have imagined she would get involved in. The woman who once accepted the crumbs of his protection was now there, head held high with unusual confidence, transformed into a true leader. Richard, accustomed to being the center of attention, soon realized that the lights of that night did not illuminate him as before. The star of the night was Ella, and he, immersed in his own arrogance, found himself disconcerted, unable to maintain the posture of superiority that had always been his trademark. The reunion happened silently. She was at a table, talking with other women who, like her, had overcome great adversity. Richard, standing in the doorway, observed the scene. At first, he didn't recognize her. It was as if time had erased the image of the woman he controlled, giving way to a stronger, more independent version, and for a moment he felt lost. He couldn't understand how she, who seemed fragile and dependent on his power, had become so untouchable. She turned, sensing his presence. Their eyes met, and deep down, something in Ella's eyes, something Richard hadn't been able to identify at the time, brought to the surface the regret he had been trying to bury. The silence between them was crushing. The first word that came out of her mouth wasn't one of resentment, but of bewilderment. "You're different." She watched him for a long moment, her eyes no longer captivated by Richard's commanding figure, but rather by a cold curiosity. "I've changed." He smiled, trying to maintain his composure, but there was something in his voice that betrayed his disconcerting surprise. "It seems time has been kind to you." It was more than just time, Richard. It was the pain and the overcoming. He didn't know how to react. The woman he thought had been his submissive now stood before him as a stronger, more mature version of herself, someone he no longer controlled. The woman he had despised, believing her transformation to be a weakness, was now the one thing he couldn't control. What would happen now? He was facing a version of Ella that he no longer knew how to handle. The old memories of control and manipulation crumbled before a woman he barely knew, but whose words at the same time awakened something within him: regret. Ella sat down at the table, but her eyes were fixed on Richard. Time had been cruel to him in many ways, but something inside her still made her wonder how he was now, after all these years. She knew that, however much he had changed, the city and the world they had lived in together remained the same. The luxury of large corporations, the gala banquets, the selfishness disguised as success. None of that affected her anymore. But deep down, she felt a bitter nostalgia for what she had been, the woman who sacrificed herself in the name of a sick love, who believed that submission was synonymous with affection. Richard, on the other hand, remained the embodiment of his own company and power. There was no longer room for vulnerability in his life. The president of Hale Industries, a technology and finance empire, represented the face of a new American era, where the powerful ruled from behind curtains of silk and concrete, masking insecurities with a facade of unwavering confidence. He never questioned his need to control everything around him and still believed that this was the only way to exist. However, in his loneliest moments, a strange feeling would overwhelm him, a self-doubt, something his logical mind always tried to push away. The hall where Ella's foundation had held the event was not only a symbol of her work with vulnerable women, it was also a reflection of how far she had distanced herself from the life Richard still led. The setting was filled with details, like an old mansion in the center of New York, with its gilded chandeliers and large windows reflecting the streetlights. However, the atmosphere there was unlike any party or event Richard was used to attending. There was a transformative energy in the air, something he could never understand if he continued to see the world only through his own lens of power and control. Ella, however, was no longer intimidated by this environment. She knew that city like no one else, but now she saw it from a new perspective. She remembered the lonely afternoons she spent in cafes, observing people in their daily lives, trying to understand what was real in that world. The city was not only a reflection of large corporations, but also of a system that constantly repeated the cycle of submission and ascension. Ella had broken this cycle and become a new woman, much more aware of her place in the world and her own values. The details of her transformation were visible to anyone who paid attention. Her short, bold hair, the way she dressed, without needing extravagance to stand out. She now wore understated clothes, with a touch of subtle elegance that conveyed her self-sufficiency and inner strength. When she spoke, her voice didn't waver, and her words were measured, unafraid to speak the truth, however uncomfortable it might be for others. She thought about the things that had shaped her over the past few years. After leaving New York, Ella isolated herself in a small town in the countryside, far from the spotlight. There, she dedicated herself to studying psychology, focusing on helping women who, like her, found themselves trapped in abusive relationships. For years, Ella was a shadow of her former self, trying to understand herself until something within her awakened. She began to understand that love could not be a prison, that true freedom lay in reconnecting with who she truly was, without shackles, without depending on anyone's approval, not even Richard's. While she reflected on all of this, Richard watched from afar. He was no longer the man he remembered. Ella's gaze now carried a strength he had never known she possessed. During all those years they had been together, he had never thought that the woman who stood in his shadow would be capable of taking control of her own life. But there, in that room, she was immersed in an aura of silent power, and Richard no longer knew how to deal with it. Soft music played in the background as Ella chatted with other women who had been rescued from similar situations. She was completely at ease, surrounded by people who saw her as an example. Richard couldn't stop watching her, and the discomfort he felt was palpable. What was happening to him? Where was the man who could simply order and get what he wanted? Now he was facing a woman who made him feel small. The room was filled with lively conversation, but for Richard, time seemed to have stood still. He no longer knew what to do with the feeling that the woman he once believed he possessed had become something completely different and far more powerful than he had ever imagined. As the night wore on, Richard couldn't take his eyes off Ella. She seemed to be in her element, comfortable, self-assured, something he never imagined he'd see in her. Those women around her, all so imposing and confident, spoke to Richard's former delicate and fragile flower as if she were an equal, not someone he had molded to his will years ago. That sense of superiority that Richard had always carried was beginning to crumble. He, who had always been able to control even the most delicate situations, was now at the mercy of his own insecurities. How could he have been so blind? How could he not have perceived the strength that Ella hid beneath her vulnerability? It was a bitter irony. The man who ruled empires now found himself dominated by the memory of a woman he had judged weak. She, however, showed no sign of suffering or resentment. Her expression was sometimes difficult to read. For Richard, this was even more disconcerting. What he feared most was no longer being able to reach her heart, to mold her as he had in the past. He still had the power to impact many people, but not Ella. That night, during a conversation with other women, Richard approached. He tried to start a casual conversation, a test of his own self-control. "You've really changed, Ella. I see that time has been a good teacher to you." Ella looked at him for a moment, with an expression that was both calm and penetrating. "Time is a good teacher, but it also reveals the true nature of things, Richard. I've learned to see beyond what was obvious." He smiled, trying to hide his growing discomfort. "What do you mean by that? Do you think I don't see things clearly?" Ella lowered her gaze, her fingers tapping on the wine glass she held. The tension between them was beginning to intensify. She knew Richard expected a reaction, that he was testing her limits, but she wouldn't play his game. "I saw what you wanted me to see, and I even thought I was happy that way," she replied coldly, her voice sounding like a sharp blade. "But you never really saw me, Richard. You didn't see me in my entirety." Her words hit Richard like a blow, and he immediately tried to turn the conversation to his advantage, but words failed him. He knew she was right. But what truly bothered him was the fact that, despite all his years of power, influence, and manipulation, he no longer had control over the one person he thought he could mold to his will. "You've changed a lot, Ella," Richard said, trying to boost her ego. "But the things we shared, they don't just fade away like that." Ella smiled softly, almost as if she wanted to give him one last chance to save himself from his own trap. "I don't care anymore about what happened, Richard. I don't want to be defined by you anymore, and whatever it was, it's in the past now. I've built something of my own." Her answer was clear and definitive. There was no longer room for the man he had been to her. There was no longer room for the emotional manipulation he used to employ. Richard realized, then and there, that the woman before him was no longer the same Ella he had known. She didn't need him to feel complete or strong. On the contrary, he depended on her more than she had ever needed him. It was a surreal turn for the man who had always been in control, now facing a woman who was taking command of her own life and of his presence in the room. For a moment, Richard felt something he had never imagined: vulnerability. What he had always considered Ella's weakness, she had transformed into her greatest strength. This disoriented him even more, and he began to question his own actions and choices. But Richard's ego wouldn't allow him to give up so easily. He wasn't ready to admit he'd been defeated, that someone so close to him had become his greatest threat. He would need to reclaim what he considered his, but the methods he would use now would be more subtle and more disguised. Ella, for her part, was unwilling to fall back into the clutches of the past. She knew that deep down, Richard still wanted something from her, but what he didn't know was that she had moved past that phase of her life. She was no longer available to be dominated by anyone, not even him. The game was now about to change once and for all. While Richard struggled to control his emotions, trying to regain lost ground, Ella was immersed in another world. Although the event was a psychological battleground for her, her true life mission lay with the women around her. Each conversation with those women renewed her purpose. She, who had once been subjugated by Richard's love, now found strength in other stories, in other examples of overcoming adversity. One of the women who caught her attention was Clara, a young woman who, like Ella, had been involved in an abusive relationship. Clara, however, was still in the process of overcoming it, with many insecurities and doubts. When they met for the first time, Ella saw a reflection of herself in Clara, a lost woman searching for her own identity amidst the chaos. "You seem to know exactly what to do, Ella," Clara said with almost painful sincerity. I feel like I'm starting over. Like I have to rebuild everything." Ella smiled, but her gaze was distant, recalling her own moments of vulnerability. There is no perfect beginning. Transformation is a process. It's not easy, but it's necessary. While they talked, Richard watched from afar, unnoticed, but his mind was completely absorbed. He couldn't comprehend how Ella had managed to transform herself like that, how she had become a leader among those women, all with their own struggles, all with their own stories of suffering. Richard had always believed that control was the only path to success, but Ella was proving him wrong. She didn't need control, she simply led with authenticity. The conflict within Richard was beginning to deepen. He had always thought he could mold people in his image, but Ella was showing him that true strength doesn't come from dominance, but from the freedom to be who you are. And that disconcerted him in a way he never imagined possible. He knew that, although Ella had distanced herself from him physically, the influence he had over her, or rather the lack thereof, was corroding her sense of power. But what Richard didn't understand most was that Ella hadn't just distanced herself from the relationship. She had distanced herself from the version of herself he had shaped. She was a new woman now, but she still carried with her the pain of a lifetime of manipulation. What she never knew was that even when she distanced herself from him, Richard's shadow still lingered in her decisions, even in the way she interacted with others. However, as Ella helped Clara get back on her feet, she realized how her journey had shaped her, and the weight of it all began to weigh on her again. She was not a leader without scars, and the emotional wounds from her relationship with Richard were still there, silent but deep. As strong as she appeared, there were still moments when doubt overwhelmed her. One night, as the event was drawing to a close, Ella retreated to a quiet corner of the hall, trying to cope with the whirlwind of emotions that was surging. Deep down, she felt that her struggle wasn't with Richard, but with herself. Her transformation wasn't just about what others saw, but about the internal battles she still faced. Suddenly, Richard appeared beside her, silent as a shadow. He seemed calmer, but there was something in his gaze she couldn't ignore. The tension between them was palpable, and Ella felt the weight of the moment. He leaned slightly toward her, his voice soft, but with a hint of urgency. "I know you've changed, Ella," he said, "but do you really think everything we went through was in vain? That there's nothing good in what we did together?" Ella looked at him, her eyes now as determined as her voice. "What we did together, Richard, was destructive. You never saw me, never understood me. You can't rewrite our story, and I won't let it define me anymore." Those words, which might have sounded cruel, were actually a reflection of what Ella had learned. She wasn't just rejecting Richard, but also her own emotional dependence on him. She was finally freeing herself not only from the abusive relationship, but also from the memories she still carried. While the two remained there, locked in a silent confrontation, the event seemed to continue in the background. But for Richard and Ella, the world around them was crumbling. The struggle was no longer about what had happened, but about what they were both willing to accept now. Richard, the loss of control over the woman he once thought was his. Ella, letting go of the emotional weight that still bound her to the past. The tension between Richard and Ella reached a peak that night. But what Richard didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the event about to happen would forever change the course of their lives. Richard's emotional turmoil, as he desperately tried to regain control, now became a crucial point. He knew he was losing, but he still didn't fully understand what was at stake. It was a simple letter, Or perhaps, in fact, it was more than that. Ella was in her office, reflecting on everything that had happened, when an envelope mysteriously appeared on her desk. She didn't know how it had gotten there. In reality, she had already become accustomed to the fact that her past with Richard still lingered over her in one way or another, but she had never imagined that he could still try to interfere in her life. Upon opening the envelope, Ella found something unexpected. A letter from Richard. It was simple, yet direct, and seemed almost like a plea, as if he were somehow surrendering. What caught her attention, however, was the content. He was no longer talking about a return, nor a reconciliation, but about something darker and more personal. "I know you despise me now, but there's something I need to tell you, something that could change everything between us. I can't let you continue on your path without knowing the truth. I can't live with this. I'm not the man you knew anymore, and I know what we did together was wrong. But there's a secret you need to know to understand everything." The letter wasn't very long, but the final words shocked her. "I can't live with this. I can't live knowing that you don't know the truth about what happened to you that night." She read those words repeatedly. What did he mean by that? What did he know? What didn't she know? Then a chill ran down her spine. There was a night when it all happened, a night when she had disappeared without explanation, when Richard had searched for her. But she was far from him, far from everything. She knew there was something dark behind that disappearance, something he never wanted to reveal. She had distanced herself to escape him, but a part of her mind always lingered around that unfinished story. Ella looked at the letter and felt a mixture of anger and disbelief. Why had he waited so long to tell the truth? What did he know that could change everything? It was as if the last piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place, and she didn't know if she was ready to face what was to come. She immediately decided to meet him. She couldn't put it off any longer. Richard's words, the promise of a revelation, were irresistible. He knew something that could shatter the image she had built of her own life, of her own past. She found him in his office later, as if fate had orchestrated that moment for them. Richard was more somber than ever, his face etched with a tension difficult to conceal. When he saw her, his expression wavered for a second, but he quickly regained his composure, as if preparing for an inevitable confrontation. "Did you read the letter?" Richard asked, his voice low but firm. Ella didn't answer immediately. She just stared at him. What did he know? What was hidden behind all of this? "Are you going to tell me what happened that night, Richard? Are you going to tell me what you've been hiding from me?" Ella asked, her voice full of an authority she never knew she possessed. Richard hesitated, but he could no longer hide. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a regret he had never shown before. "I did something I can't undo. Something that changed your life forever. Something you never knew." His voice faltered as if the weight of the words was unbearable. Ella approached him, her heart pounding. "Tell me what happened. Now." He took a deep breath before speaking. "The night you disappeared, I was involved in very shady business. And you, Ella, you became a target. There were people who wanted to get to me. I sent you away, but I knew where you were. I knew what was happening to you, and I never told you the truth." Ella felt the ground open up beneath her feet. Richard's words sounded like an explosion inside her. "You sent me away to protect me, but you never told me the truth. You left me to live with this doubt, with this pain, without knowing what really happened." Richard seemed lost, his words not coming out coherently. "I wanted to protect you, but I did what I did so you would be safe. I knew I couldn't tell you because I didn't want you to see what I really was." Now, Richard's mask was slipping. He wasn't the powerful man she imagined. He was just a man trying to cover up his own mistakes, trying to fix something that was already broken. But Ella, hearing this, felt a mixture of anger and relief. He was finally telling the truth, a truth that changed everything, but also revealed how much he still saw her as a pawn in his game. And there, in front of Richard, Ella knew that this was the decisive moment. She wouldn't back down. Now, the choice was hers. Richard's revelation was a blow to Ella, but also a liberation. Suddenly she understood everything that had been hidden, everything she hadn't known. The pieces fell into place, and she finally understood the reason for his sudden disappearance, the reason why Richard had always been so distant, so protected. But at the same time, the truth left a bitter taste in her mouth. The pain wasn't just about Richard's secret. It was about the very nature of her relationship with him. How had she been manipulated for so long? How could she have been so blind to his intentions, even when she knew, deep down, that something was wrong? She looked at Richard with a mixture of anger and sadness. He stood there before her, trying to find words to justify the unjustifiable, but there was no more room for excuses. Not now, not after so much time and so much pain. "Do you think you can just tell me this and expect everything to be forgiven?" Ella said, her voice low but heavy with intensity. "You made me believe in a love that never existed, Richard. I was a pawn in your game, and all you did was push me away when I needed you." Richard felt the weight of her words, like a blade cutting through his soul. He had always believed his actions were justifiable, that he was merely protecting her. But now, looking into Ella's eyes, he saw the reality of his betrayal. He could no longer convince himself that his actions had been right. He knew he had failed in something deeper than he could have imagined. "I didn't know what to do, Ella. I wanted to protect you, but the circumstances were bigger than me. I was involved in something you would never understand, and I needed to—" He paused, unsure how to continue. "I thought that if you left, if you made your life away from all this, you would be safe." Ella interrupted him, her voice trembling with emotion. "Safe? You left me alone, Richard. And worse, you never told me the truth. Every day you made me believe a lie. And now you want me to accept this? No, I can't, Richard. I can't believe anything you tell me anymore." The pain in Richard's heart was unbearable. He knew he had lost, that the woman he had loved, the one he believed to be his, could no longer be a part of his life. The impact of his actions was finally reflecting in a truth he could not deny. The realization that he had lost Ella forever hurt him less than the revelation that he had, in a way, destroyed his own humanity by trying to control her. But Ella's pain was equally profound. As much as she tried to convince herself that the fight with Richard had been about her personal growth, the truth was that she felt betrayed in an almost irreparable way. How could she trust anyone again? How could she believe in any relationship based on lies and manipulation? She turned away from him, walking to the window with her arms crossed over her chest. The city light illuminated her face, but she didn't see it. Her mind was occupied trying to process everything she had just heard. Richard stood there, waiting for her to speak, but she was lost in thought. The silence between them was heavy with an undeniable tension. Finally, Ella spoke, her voice calmer now, but still carrying immense weight. "I can't go back to what we were, Richard. I can't go back to being the woman you wanted me to be. I finally understand that my worth doesn't depend on you. You told me you loved me, but you never let me be who I truly am. Now, I know who I am, and it has nothing to do with you." Richard wanted to respond. He wanted to say something that could correct what he had done, but he knew that words weren't enough. The destruction of his relationship with Ella had no simple solution. He could no longer see himself as the man who had everything under control, the man who knew what he wanted. He no longer knew who he was, and that consumed him. That night, for both of them, wasn't just about Richard's revelation. It was about the end of a cycle of lies, manipulation, and pain. It was the end of a relationship that, no matter how hard they tried to save it, could never be rebuilt. Ella had finally broken free, and Richard, in his attempt to reclaim something that should never have been his, discovered that, in trying to control her life, he had lost the only thing that truly mattered: trust. The most painful consequence, however, was not the separation itself, but the emptiness that remained. Both now faced the consequences of their actions, and the journey of healing and self-discovery was only beginning. The following days were difficult for Ella. Even after the confrontation with Richard, something inside her still questioned herself. She knew the truth had been revealed, but the pain and anger continued to haunt her. She was alone in a way, but also stronger than ever. The weight of what Richard had done seemed lighter, but what truly weighed on her heart was the echo of years of emotional suffering that she still needed to heal. The first time she looked in the mirror after the confrontation, she felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't a simple relief, but a profound one, as if an invisible cloak had been lifted from her shoulders. She was no longer the submissive woman Richard had molded her into. She was finally herself. The rebuilding process was gradual. She began to dedicate more time to her work, to her own growth, and to the women who had become a part of her life. Her passion for helping other women, especially those who, like her, had been emotionally abused, flourished. She no longer saw herself as someone who needed Richard's approval or anyone else's. She was finally in control of her own life. Ella's relationship with Clara, the young woman she had met the night of the event, began to deepen. Clara, who was still facing her own internal battles, became a kind of reflection of Ella, a woman searching for her true identity. Ella knew she could help her, but more than that, she would help her avoid the mistakes she herself had made in the past. "I don't know how you managed to find the strength after everything, Ella," Clara once said, her eyes brimming with gratitude. I still can't believe you went through all that." Ella smiled, a genuine but sad smile. "I didn't find strength, Clara. I created it. Strength doesn't come from outside. It comes from within. We all have that strength, even if we don't know it." Those words stayed with Clara, and with Ella as well. She was no longer the woman Richard had known, and perhaps that was what made her so invincible now. She had created her own strength, forged in adversity, in the dark nights when she thought she would never overcome, but she did. She was alive. And more importantly, she was in control of her own narrative. Meanwhile, Richard was beginning to face the harsh reality of his actions. After the confrontation with Ella, he withdrew, distancing himself from everything and everyone. He didn't know where to begin nor how to rebuild his life. The pain of seeing Ella drift away from him was more than he imagined he could bear. He had always thought his power would protect him, that his ability to manipulate situations and people would allow him to achieve anything. But now, he was alone. He tried to regain control of his company, but realized that, however much he was still a leader, his empire no longer had the same influence without the trust of the people who once trusted him. He no longer had control over his own emotions, and guilt consumed him. What he had done to Ella was now constantly etched in his mind. He could no longer convince himself that his actions were justifiable, that he was still in control. The power he so cherished now seemed like a prison. Richard's transformation was more subtle, but no less significant. He began to question his choices, to reassess what truly mattered in his life. He sought professional help, something he had never imagined doing. He knew he needed to confront his own flaws, not as a powerful man, but as a broken man. Richard's journey was internal, and he knew it wouldn't be easy. He didn't know if he could regain people's trust or if he would ever be able to look at himself without feeling ashamed, but he knew he needed to try. Meanwhile, Ella began to look to the future with more hope. She no longer felt imprisoned by the shadows of the past. What she valued most now was her freedom, the freedom to be who she truly was, without needing anyone's validation. She decided she would found an organization to support women, a space where they could find the same strength and support she had found on her journey. It was her way of giving back to the world, of helping other women find their freedom. She also thought about her own desires and dreams. Although her relationship with Richard had been devastating, she knew it wouldn't be the end of her story. She wanted to travel, learn new languages, explore the world. She wanted to continue growing, not as the woman someone else had molded her into, but as the woman she chose to be. She knew the future wouldn't be easy, but now she had all the necessary tools to face it. While Richard was still seeking redemption, Ella had already taken the first step toward her own. She no longer needed approval or forgiveness. What she needed was herself. And she had finally found herself. The wind blew cold that night. Ella was in her office, but the atmosphere seemed heavier than ever. She felt a growing pressure, something about to explode. What had happened to Richard, her past, everything seemed to be reaching its climax. She knew something big was about to happen, but she couldn't predict what it would be. The peace she had found in the last few months was about to be tested once again. She had spent so much time rebuilding herself, helping other women rise up, focused on her new purpose, that now, when things were almost at the peak of her transformation, it seemed the universe was about to push her back into the turmoil. She felt the calm was just a false illusion, something that only existed because she was away from Richard. But what if he came back? What if the lies he still carried with him resurfaced once more? She stood up and looked out at the illuminated city outside. Life went on with its routine and commitments, but inside something was constantly stirring, like a storm about to break. She knew she couldn't avoid what was coming. Richard, on the other hand, was not at peace. He had spent weeks withdrawing from everything, trying to understand who he really was after the truth was revealed. But even without the trust of those around him, he knew that his past with Ella was not yet resolved. He hadn't finished his journey of redemption. In fact, he was still trying to find a way to correct the mistakes he had made. But at the same time, he found himself increasingly detached from the reality he had imagined. The powerful man he had been was disappearing, and he could barely recognize the figure he was becoming. Reality began to hit him hard. His business was failing. His shortcomings as a leader were starting to surface, and he no longer had the same influence he once did. The support he used to have was slowly dwindling. Richard knew that to keep what remained, he would need to do something drastic, something big. And the idea of winning Ella back resurfaced in his mind. But this time, the approach would be different. He knew he couldn't simply force his presence back into her life. Not after everything she had been through, not after everything he had done to her, but he had an idea, one last attempt to win back the woman who, in one way or another, still occupied his thoughts, his actions. Meanwhile, Ella was confronted with an unexpected situation. An anonymous letter arrived. It was an enigmatic message, something that alluded to Richard's involvement in matters far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The letter said that he was not only involved in shady dealings, but that there were more dark secrets about him, things that could destroy everything she thought she knew. The letter hinted that Richard was connected to a much larger network of corruption and manipulation, something she had never imagined possible. The letter didn't explicitly state what was happening, but the words were clear. If you think you know everything about him, you're very wrong. Richard isn't the man you think he is. He never was. This deeply affected Ella. What was happening? She had already overcome so much, rebuilt herself after so many emotional blows, but now it seemed the past was returning to haunt her, with a new and terrifying dimension. She didn't know what to do with this information. Were they just more lies from Richard, or was there something more behind it, something she needed to discover before it was too late? With the weight of that letter in her hands, Ella felt a growing pressure. She knew the next step couldn't be taken lightly. She needed answers, and she needed to get to the bottom of this story, no matter how painful it was. She was willing to risk everything to discover the truth, once and for all. However, Richard knew that the only way to control his situation was to further manipulate the invisible threads of the plot he had woven. He was about to do something audacious, something that would make Ella reconsider her position, perhaps even her opinion of him. He was willing to use every card he had, every connection he had left, to finally recover what he thought he had lost. The tension between the two was beginning to take shape. Ella and Richard's destinies were about to intertwine again in a way that would change everything for both of them. Ella was about to confront the truth once more. Richard was about to make his final move. And what neither of them knew was that this final battle would be more intense than either of them could have imagined. The city was shrouded in darkness, but streetlights illuminated the sidewalks and buildings, creating a strange and unsettling contrast. Ella was in her apartment contemplating the anonymous letter she had received. The truth about Richard still echoed in her mind, but she knew she needed to make a decision. If the story the letter hinted at was true, she was about to face something far greater than she imagined. Something that could destroy not only her life, but also the lives of many others. She no longer had time to hesitate. Suddenly, the sound of a car stopping in front of her building made her look out the window. Richard, she recognized him immediately, even without seeing him clearly. He was there on the street, once again trying to get closer. The tension in the air was palpable. What did he want now? After everything that had happened between them, why did he keep trying, insisting on maintaining a bond that seemed impossible to rebuild? Before she could process what was happening, the phone rang. It was a text message from Clara, her friend and ally, who had recently discovered vital information about Richard. The message was direct. "He's more involved in the underworld than you realize, Ella. What you know about his past may only be the tip of the iceberg. Be careful." That was it. Ella knew that what was behind Richard wasn't limited to emotional manipulation. There was something much darker involving his past, something she had never known, something he had tried to hide from everyone, even from her. Without hesitation, Ella grabbed her bag and left the apartment, heading towards where Richard was waiting. Each step reflected a decision that could no longer be postponed. She had no more doubts that whatever was happening, she needed to face it head-on. Richard wouldn't be able to escape this time. When she met him in the street, by the lamplight, they were silent for a few seconds. Richard looked different from the last time she had seen him. He was paler, more withdrawn, and his eyes, normally firm and imposing, were now filled with regret. His presence, instead of dominating as before, now seemed to falter. "You know what's going on, don't you?" Ella asked, her voice tense and serious. Richard looked at her for a moment, as if weighing his words, but the silence between them only increased the pressure. He could no longer hide the truth. "Not now." "I know what you're thinking, Ella," he began, his voice lower than usual. "I know what's behind your suspicions. But you don't know everything. You don't know the real reason behind all this." Ella felt a knot in her stomach. She knew that this conversation would change everything. She also knew that the only way to discover the truth was to let him speak, without interruptions, without worrying about what she wanted to hear. "Speak. Tell me everything," she replied, her tone resolute. "I'm no longer the woman you used to manipulate, and this lie is going to end now, Richard." Richard sighed, as if finally surrendering. He looked at the floor before beginning to reveal what she already knew, but in a way she couldn't have expected. "I'm not just a successful businessman, Ella. I'm not just a man of power. I got involved in something much bigger, something that started before the two of us. I didn't know what to do when things started to get out of control, and I didn't know how you would react when you found out the truth about what I really do." Ella felt her heart clench. What was he saying? She wasn't prepared to hear it, not the way he was saying it now. "I worked for some very powerful people. People in the government, in the underworld. I didn't want you to know this because deep down, I knew you would never accept it. But now you need to understand, everything I did was because I wanted to protect you. I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know how to bring you into this dirty world. You used me, Richard. You used me as a pawn in your game. I was just another victim in your story of manipulation, Ella replied, her voice trembling with anger. You made me believe you were protecting me, but all you did was hide the truth from me. And now you want me to believe you did this out of protection? I can't believe anything you say anymore. He closed his eyes, as if feeling the pain of the truth. He knew she was right, but he also knew there was no going back. The trust she once placed in him was irrevocably broken. What he feared most had happened. He had lost her, and nothing could fix that. Before he could say anything more, Ella made a definitive gesture, as if sealing the end of that story. She turned to leave, but deep down she knew that this would be the last time she would see Richard, the last time he would have any control over her. Good luck, Richard, she said, in a tone that reflected not anger but acceptance. But my life no longer depends on you. You've lost everything. She left without looking back. Richard stood there, frozen, the weight of his choices finally crushing him. He had reached a point of no return. Ella never imagined that one day her life would take the turn it did. She had always been a strong woman, but there were times when she felt lost, as if the decisions of others, especially Richard's, had the power to shape her destiny. But not anymore. After the final confrontation, she felt that, finally, she was free. Free from Richard, free from the lies and manipulation, and above all, free from herself, from the woman who believed she needed someone to be complete. Over time, Ella distanced herself from the pain, although the memory of what she had been through still haunted her. But she didn't allow it to define her. She began to truly rebuild herself on a solid and healthier foundation, without depending on the past to understand who she was. She founded the Organization for Women, a space where they could heal, strengthen, and help each other. Her experience had prepared her for this mission. Ella found a purpose greater than any relationship or betrayal could offer. She became an independent woman, no longer entangled in the shadows of a man who, although she had loved him, no longer deserved her time or energy. Meanwhile, Richard found himself alone, his business in decline and his connections shattered. His attempt to win Ella back had failed, but the emptiness he felt didn't stem solely from her loss. He knew he had lost himself completely. His actions, driven by a need for power and control, had consumed him. The consequences of his choices had finally reached their peak. He didn't know what his future held. Without anyone's trust, without the support of his network of powerful allies, Richard had to start over. But now he was alone. He knew that nothing he could do would erase what he had done to Ella. The distance between them was irreparable, and he was beginning to accept that perhaps he would never be able to recover what he had lost. They were both on different yet equally challenging journeys. While Ella moved away from her past and embraced a new life, Richard continued to grapple with the ghosts of his, but subtly both had changed. Ella now stronger, more aware of her worth, and Richard more conscious of his flaws, more vulnerable. Neither controlled the other's destiny anymore. They were now following separate paths, but somehow still connected by the history they had shared. What had begun as a story of manipulation and betrayal was now transforming into one of redemption and growth. The true victory lay not in who had emerged victorious, but in who, in the end, had freed themselves. And Ella, the woman who had once been dominated by Richard's shadow, had risen. No longer as a victim, but as a victor in her own story. Months later, Ella walked the city streets with a newfound lightness. Her organization was growing, and she had found a peace she never imagined possible. The scars of the past, though still present, no longer dominated her days. She knew her journey wouldn't end here, but finally she was in control of her own narrative. Meanwhile, Richard had completely distanced himself from the circle he was moving in. He sought a new beginning, but something inside him still consumed him. He could never forget Ella, but she had already left him behind, and perhaps that was the greatest punishment. If you identified with Ella or Richard's journey, or if the story touched your heart in any way, share your thoughts. The struggle for independence, forgiveness, and personal growth is something we all face, and their experiences can inspire others. How would you handle a similar situation? What would you do if you were challenged to rise above something as painful as a manipulative relationship? Leave your opinion in the comments. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and continue the journey of self-discovery.